Let's turn to the global economy. And after the volatility on world markets last week, all eyes are now on Europe to see if nations there can avoid a debt crisis that drags the whole world into recession. The European Central Bank is taking moves to prop up the ailing economies of Spain and Italy, and other countries in the region are trying to plug holes in their finances too. But will it be enough? One person watching the situation very closely is the President of the World Bank, Robert Zoellick. He's currently in Australia to attend the Australian-American Leadership Dialogue, and we spoke earlier. Bob Zoellick, welcome to the program.
Glad to be with you.
How do you think the economic volatility we're witnessing around the globe at the moment compares to the financial crisis of 2008, 2009?
Well, I think we're just into a different phase of that crisis, because until a couple of weeks ago, we were having a multi-speed recovery where many of the developed countries, the U.S., Europe in particular, were struggling with some of the sovereign debt issues, but then also high unemployment. But the emerging markets, which I work with at the World Bank, had kind of the world turned upside down. They were growing and recovering quite well. I think what we saw over the past couple of weeks was a quicker and deeper erosion of confidence in markets in the U.S. and Europe in particular, in a sense, the economic pathways and the leadership decisions. And so different circumstances, but by converging together, I think it moved us into a phase that actually is a more dangerous phase now. And one of the differences between now and 2008, in 2008, countries had more fiscal space to be able to have expansion. Monetary policy could be used, and right now interest rates are pretty low everywhere. So some of the countries are really less able to use some of the tools, although as a first round, as you saw in Europe, the ECB, the European Central Bank, is still going to try to use those tools. But now you're at the stage where to regain confidence, countries are going to have to deal with some of the fundamentals.
You say it's a more dangerous phase. Is it sufficiently serious that we could be looking at a global recession? When you look at what's happening in the US and Europe, not to mention Japan, could it be?
Well, I'm always a little wary of predictions, but I guess what I will say in particular is I think that when you have an erosion of market confidence, which you could certainly see when in Europe this spread to Spanish, Italian, even sort of the French market, when you saw some of the downgrade in the United States, which I think is more of a warning sign than sort of an ultimate judgment, then you got to be aware of whether that lack of confidence could start to spread to consumers and business confidence. So I guess it's a fragile moment, and what that suggests to me is that the economic policy makers, as we go into the fall, are going to have some harder demands on them, not just the quick actions, but frankly some of the structural issues that Australia was able to address across both political parties in the late 80s and 90s.
Everyone's, of course, looking at Europe at the moment and wondering how that's going to play out. Do you think that imposing austerity measures is the right way to go, or do those countries need to be looking at introducing more stimulus measures? And if stimulus, where will that money come from?
Well, I think you have to look at each economy and each circumstance. But I think your basic point is correct, is that I think the stimulus prospects for all, perhaps other than Germany, has kind of run its course. They have high debt, and actually there would be greater anxieties. But I think the big issue is this. When the Europeans created monetary union, they really had to make a choice. Would they keep it with a small set of countries that had a similar set of policies? Would they go bigger? They went bigger. If they went bigger, the second choice is, were they going to keep discipline on some of these issues that we've seen come a cropper now? And they didn't. And so the real challenge now is, are you either going to move to a fiscal union that complements the monetary union, or do you have some other pathway, which isn't so clear within the current Eurozone prospects? That's a very tough political choice, particularly in Germany, and that's exactly the choice that's going to be forced this fall.
Well, in that case then, is this sort of economic volatility and the serious structural reforms that are required going to lead to a period of political instability in Europe?
Well, you know, it's certainly not good for governments, but you can also see sometimes governments that make tough decisions, sometimes that's rewarded by the voters. So again, I don't think you can generalize along one path or another. I mean, I actually admire President Zapatero of Spain. He's not only taken tough decisions, but he's called early elections so that the public will stand by and support that. Britain, for example, was also a country that was facing these challenges. I think the British government, to its complement, sort of set a long-term strategy. And as you can see, it actually has helped it in bond markets and it's helped it with its ratings. But then it has to have the fortitude to maintain it.
Well, there were some people last week arguing that it was the austerity measures in the UK that contributed to those riots that we saw, and that it's to do with the tensions between the haves and the have-nots. How did you read that?
Well, it's so striking to me because I work with developing countries and I see really poor people. And to me, the idea that poverty leads people to riot is an insult to hundreds of millions of poor people that I work with around the world who frankly want an opportunity, want to have an education, want to have a chance to climb up the ladder. So I don't believe that was the fundamental cause. There's obviously other serious things going wrong with that segment of society. As
you say, you travel around the world and you see legitimately the gap that exists between the wealthiest nations and the poorest people in the world. Do you worry that over the coming decades we will see that spilling into more political conflict?
Well, so far we've been in a period where developing countries have been on the upswing. So about a half of global growth now comes from developing countries. That might have been 20% in the 1990s. You've had a huge reduction in poverty, in part driven by some of the policies in China and India and elsewhere. There's still huge challenges. And so what I worry about is, as the developed economies struggle, will this lead them to pull back? Will you have isolationism? So anytime you have turmoil in international markets, you have to be a little worried. And part of my job is to point out these issues and see where we can help as an institution with the World Bank.
Mr. Zoellick, thank you very much for making time to speak to us today.
My pleasure.